that's the title you just heard. And about me, well, you just heard my background. Just to combine it with the thing that I'm going to be talking about today. When I first came into game writing, I was used to working with actors from film and TV and theater. But the first couple of games I wrote for had dialogue, but now voice dialogue. So that was something that was a big difference for me. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this talk, to explain a bit about that. So Hearts Medicine is one of the games I worked on. We'll see a bit about that later. The Criminal Minds game I did was also unvoiced, but Criminal Minds is obviously a big TV series. And the game has the same characters. So everybody who was working on the game and everybody who would play the game knows the characters from like 15 seasons of TV series. So we all know how they talk. So I had to think about their voices, but then not use them, which was also a different step. And then recently I wrote Old Frequencies, which is a game that's totally voiced and has no images of people in it. So that was totally the other way around. I only had to write dialogue for voices instead of just thinking about animated characters and text balloons. So that was a bit of a trip going through different things. And that's basically the reason why I wanted to share some of my tips and tricks. Obviously, disclaimer, there's a lot of it that doesn't apply to every game and everything, but these are my experiences at least, and I hope that you will get something out of it. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about 4 different things, 4 tips, if you will. One thing that is kind of a debate, and then one final getting started kind of tip. I don't need to forget what says at the top. Not really used yet to that difference between writing voice dialogue or non-voice dialogue. I think of it as film versus comic book, because that's what it was for me. They're both dialogue, but it's not like literature. It's definitely like comic books because most of the time you'll have animated characters or slightly animated characters based on what kind of game you're making. And they'll have like text balloons or they'll have text below their images. But if your game is non-voiced, you will have that interaction between the image and the text. So that's why I think that comic books are really a nice comparison when you do that. Okay, so first tip is about characterization via voice. So basically, when you write something that has a voice that you can hear in your game, you have a lot to play with. You have the sound of somebody's voice, you have the accent, you have a possible dialect, you have a vocabulary, you have speech patterns. Now, when you do written games, you have part of that. You can still use the dialect because a lot of dialect you can write down as well. You still have the vocabulary. You have a bit of speech pattern, maybe. But there's also other things you can use, which is recurring words and specific sentences. That's a great way to also make a character's speech pattern really distinctive by just writing it down. But make sure you don't go overboard with that because just as, for instance, listening to somebody with a really heavy accent or a really heavy speech impediment can be tiring to your ears, the same goes for reading. So, for instance, if you have somebody who has a lot of repeated words in a sentence, it can be annoying after a while to read that all of the time. So If you're unsure about that, think about subtitles. I did a lot of subtitling years ago, and there are specific rules for subtitling, which is, one of the rules is, for instance, don't repeat words. So if a character says, like, stutters a bit or says the same word like 3 times in a row, you only subtitle it once. And you do that because that's easier to read. Those rules aren't there for nothing, so don't go overboard too much in the way you write dialogue if it's unvoiced. Make it distinctive, but don't make it so distinctive that people will be annoyed while they read it. Okay, second tip, jokes and irony. This was one of the things that I really had to learn when I went into game writing, because I was used to using a lot of jokes and irony in my work. And then I found out that it didn't work when people did it not out loud. Because, well, in voice you have so much to work with, and also if you do it the other way around, so for instance, if you have never done voice dialogue and you're about to do that, think about this, because there's so much to do with jokes and irony that you can do with, like the timing, obviously, inflections, so the way your voice works, body language, facial expression are all things that you can do. The body language and the facial expression you can also do when it's non-voiced, depending on what kind of game you make and depending on how elaborate your animations are. But what you can't use are the timing and the inflections. And that's, especially in irony, is really a big part of it. So make sure your words don't fall flat. You might hear it in your head. You might hear how a character says it, but the player won't hear that. The player will just read it. And they might know the character well enough to have some sort of idea of how they would say it, but they won't have it enough like you have it in your head. So if you write stuff like this for non-voiced characters, try to sort of turn off the sound in your head. Don't listen to that person anymore, and just try to focus on what are these words, and do they still convey the message that I want to impose on people. And as a tip, think about like written conversations like email. Twitter is a really good medium. You see sometimes that people's jokes on Twitter are really successful, or they just fall flat. That all has to do with things like this. Or you can get an email and somebody sends it to you and they think it's really friendly and you think it's not. That's all to do with you hearing in your head how you say it when you type it. So if you want to find the nuances of that difference, try to look into emails. Twitter, social media is really perfect for examples of what works and what doesn't work. Okay, we go to the third tip, and that's all about pacing. Pacing is basically the pacing of your story, the pacing of your dialogue, the pacing of your characters. In general, if you do voiced dialogue, then you will be, as the game developer, the person who decides how the pacing is. Not always. This is especially a subject where the two sort of collide, because this really depends on what kind of game you're making. There are a lot of voiced games that still have a pacing that is done by the player via like tapping to continue the story or whatever. But at least you decide like tiny chunks of the pacing, minimally. And often overlap is also possible. So overlap means that one person starts to speak when the other hasn't entirely finished. Now, when you have no voice dialogue, overlap is very difficult. You can do it in some instances, but it probably won't happen. Also something that is hard to read sometimes. And the player decides basically what the pace of the story is. Again, there can be some tiny differences in that, but this is generally how it works. And this is a really important part of what you're doing in your writing, even though you don't realize it when you're writing. This is definitely something to try and test out. And I want to give you one example so you can see the differences between those two. I have a small clip, 20-second clip from Hearts Medicine, one of the games I worked on. And that's a game that's non-voiced. And, well, we'll first see the 20-second clip without sound. Usually when you play the game, there's music. But for reasons I'll explain later, you don't hear the music now. Okay, so this is a mobile game that takes place in a hospital, and this is the main character on the right hand, Alison Hart, and her boyfriend / colleague on the left. I'm just going to show you 20 seconds. Just read along. Okay, so I'm going to show you this clip again, but then with the sound on, because as you can see below, it says Hearts Medicine Doctor's Oath voiced. We had some great fans from the USA who dabble in voice acting, and they decided to do voices for the entire game. So they basically have like 2 hours worth of scenes all voiced. It's excellent. I mean, their voice acting is perfect, and it's beautiful, and it's an honor that they did all this. But I don't like listening to it because I never wrote this for it to be voiced. And with the pacing part, things to me as a writer feel off. And I want you to, especially as we play it again, take note of the line just before this one. Daniel, the character on the left, says, "For all of us," and that's especially the one that makes me cringe. So.
Do you want some more? Allison?
I'm sorry. It's just...
I get it. It's a struggle to feel welcome in this new hospital. For all of us.
At least you're a licensed doctor.
I hope this sort of explains what I mean. Again, the people who did this were great. The voice actor who delivered the line, perfect. Much love to the people who did this. But there is a difference. If this had been voiced, I would have written it totally different. So hopefully this sort of explains to you a bit about the differences. And it's actually really interesting to see it like this and realize how big of a difference it is between writing for voiced and non-voiced. Okay, last one for the 4 tips. Tutorials. Again, you can debate this because this isn't true for every game. And it also is based on how much of your experience is in voice or non-voice writing. In general, if you have a voiced game, a tutorial is easier to make diegetic and fun, by which I mean it's easier to put the tutorial things inside the story, make it into a scene, make it fun, make it fun to do. If your game is not voiced, It's slightly harder because reading has a different concentration from listening to it. And often, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in doing something like that, you might be better off just sticking to, let's say, regular tutorials, making sure that you point to the right stuff and you use the right words. Because a player will be bored faster. That's always the case for non-voice dialogue. People would tend to skip through it a bit more, and you don't want that for a tutorial. So make sure people don't get bored. And it's harder to remember relevant details because audio works better in that aspect. So if you push a lot of written text onto the player, that will mean that they won't remember the things that are really relevant. So if you want to have a good tutorial, try and be safe. And then when you do a lot of user testing or you have wild ideas, please do deviate from this. But in general, this is basically what happens. Okay, so that was the 4 main subjects. Then I have a sort of a debate subject, which is about, well, I put it here like clunky lines or hard to act. There's obviously a lot of opinions on what is good and bad dialogue writing by all of us, by the players. Obviously, I think if some of you here do writing or narrative design or have experienced user critique in any way on those aspects, you will know that people have really different opinions on that. This is especially so if it's voice dialogue, because it's really hard to hear the difference between a good actor with a bad line or a bad actor with a good line, or even a good actor with a good line, people might still not enjoy it. That also has to do with personal preference. Even though we don't really realize it, we all have preferences in the way that we talk and that we want other people to talk. That's for your own language. Like people will put verbs in different orders in text than you are used to, and that will mean you might not like their writing, even though it's not wrong. There's differences in culture, like Dagmar, for instance, who did her talk this morning. She's from Belgium, I'm from the Netherlands. We speak the same language, but it's slightly different. So she might write a line that I find a bit weird, even though it's perfect in Belgium. Same goes for languages that are not your own. People who are used to playing games in English, but aren't English speaking themselves, might know what they like in writing and then get confused when something is different from what they are used to. So yeah, this is a big debate, and you'll probably never do it perfectly because of that. However, important thing, if you're not used to writing for actors, let's say you've written a lot of games, but they were always non-voiced, and now you're going to do a voiced one. Trust the actor, please do, because it's not about writing a good or a bad line or a clunky line. It's about what an actor feels comfortable with, which means that your sentence, even though for you it sounds really normal, might be really difficult for an actor to speak, because they have different speech patterns. So they're used to a different order of words in a sentence. And obviously, if you have an amazing actor, they can make most things work. But often they will also, maybe even by accident, do a line, and then they change up some words without them even realizing it. Please trust them, because in the end, when people play your game, and they hear those voices, it needs to sound good. And if you're really opposed to something, just work with them and see what works best. If you haven't worked with actors before and you've written some stuff, let other people read it out loud. Please do that within your company or with friends or whatever. Don't do it yourself, because you'll read it the way you hear it in your head, so it doesn't really make sense, because to you then everything sounds good. But just let other people read it aloud and see what happens. There's a lot of that in there that you might realize can be different or should be different. And it's also fun to do. So please do that. Last thing I want to say about this, I put here voice and text, decide what the text is, because I've been talking about voiced or non-voiced, but often if you have voiced, you'll also have the text image. And there's a lot of difference between that. You can have like the text balloons, like we saw before, which is the text verbatim, so exactly what they say. Although if actors are like, or sounds like that, you won't put them in the text balloons. Sometimes you do need to. This is Old Frequencies, the totally voiced game that we did. As you can see, this is the image from the game, so you don't see characters, but you do see the text. For this, we wrote every and and repeat in there, because if you don't have characters to focus on, you only have the text to focus on, to look at. It will be really weird if you don't see those us and ahs in there. We only realized that when we did user testing. That's really important. If you don't have that, if you have characters, then just having those lines in there can be enough. But then you can also have closed captioning if you want it to be accessible to deaf people or people who are hard of hearing as well, which is the difference between those two images, as you might be able to see. The left one has like static noise in brackets because that tells you all of the sound that you hear. Thinking about which way you will use to convey your words in your game is really important. So try and do that before you start doing it, and really think about it, because there is a big difference between the different versions. Maybe you want all of them in there, have people choose, that can happen as well. But it is something to really think about, because that really adds to the way people think about what you've written and how the actors are doing. Okay, on to the final thing. This is my getting started tip. So, if you've never done voiced or you've never done non-voiced and you're about to go from one version to the other, hopefully the tips and tricks I gave you can be a big help. These are things that, to me, make most sense. Also, if you're not yet doing this, but you want to in the future, it's never too early to start trying to see what the differences are. Like I said, in the middle is there, read your work aloud. I put there, actually, do this always. If you're experienced in voiced games, having other people read it aloud before you give it to actors is always a really good idea. Read comics. If you're used to voiced things and then going to non-voiced, which is the path that I first took, comics really helped me a lot, because you really get an idea about the way that written text works and how it works with the image. So I can't press it enough. Just read a lot of comics, also because it's great to read comics. And the other way around, if you're used to not using voice dialogue, but you are going to or you want to, it can be really interesting to read books or comic books and then go to the film adaptation, and just take a little chunk out of it and focus on the dialogue. So basically, pick a scene that you know is fairly the same in the book and in the movie, and then check to see how much of the original dialogue they used and how much of it has been changed. And obviously things have been changed just for the story and the pacing, but a lot of those changes also have to do with written words versus spoken words, and it can be really interesting to to just compare those two side by side and see if you can get something out of what they changed and why they changed it. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you for now. I hope you had a lot of get a lot of things out of it. Feel free to contact me, or I'm here this afternoon or tonight to ask questions. Thank you.